Greetings, comrades, and welcome to the show. This is your Civic Duty, a discussion-focused show where we tackle issues relevant to politics and social problems today. I'm your host, Shant, and with me today I have some wonderful guests. We have Elena, John, and Dina. Before we get started on the topic at hand, why don't we kind of go through, give ourselves a few introductions so that our viewers know who we are, what perspectives we're bringing to the table, and just some information about yourselves. So let's start with Elena.
Cool. So what's up, friends?
Hey,
I'm
yo.
Elena. In undergrad I studied gender and minority studies, and then in graduate school I did communication management. Currently working in tech, doing some tech management. So I'm trying to bring a feminist perspective on the communication strategies we're talking about.
Cool.
John, tell us about yourself.
I am John. I got my bachelor's in philosophy at UC Santa Cruz. I got my master's in English at Cal Poly Pomona, and I'm now working as a professor in English. I don't know what perspective precisely I'm offering to this podcast. More so, I'm just here to filter my thoughts. I'm mostly interested in the way that politics are discussed. Typically, I don't care what a person's politics are, but I like them to be competent with what they believe so that I have like a basis to either address it, attack it, or like debate it or learn from it. So that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, and it's everyone is going to bring something to the table, so don't worry. We have plans for you.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Dina, tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Dina, and let's see, I went to undergrad at UCLA, studied history and Spanish, which weren't completely pointless. But I went to law school at Georgetown, graduated a couple years ago, and worked for a federal judge last year, and now I'm working at a law firm here in downtown.
Nice.
And
awesome.
I think, my perspective, I guess, is I'm very much in between center of center.
Oh, okay.
So, if you have a spectrum, you have left and right, and then in between center and left, you have the center. So I'm in the center of the center and the center, if that makes sense. So
in the sense, so you're super center. You're always.
Yeah, I really do like to listen to people's viewpoints. And much like John said, I don't care what your politics are as long as it's not bash. And yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So clearly, we want to have more of a discussion-based. Something more discussion-based, which is why we have some perspectives that are maybe a little more apolitical. But then there's me, which I think all of our viewers are going to trust or already given to my credentials, which I didn't really list at all or anything. But I studied at UC Santa Barbara, political science, emphasizing comparative politics. And for a few years, I worked for the city of Glendale in public administration. And now I'm trying to get into this political media kind of field. So with that, let's kind of get started, since I guess media kind of has to do with the topic that we're talking about. So beforehand, reached out to our guests here, and I gave them an idea what we want to talk about. Basically, we wanted to talk about the use of language, the use of words within politics used by politicians, as well as the media at large. So before we kind of dive into the depth of our conversation, there's just a few things I wanted to define in case some of our viewers aren't familiar with some of these vocabulary and terms. The biggest things that I feel like we should define are, one is rhetoric, which is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing, especially the use of figures of speech and other compositional techniques. Another important one is bias, which is a prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair. And then lastly, there's opinion, which is different from bias, which is a view or judgment formed about something, not necessarily based on fact or knowledge. It's the beliefs or views of a large number of majority of people about a particular thing. So
Those are very good definitions.
Thank you.
Very straightforward and clear.
Thank you. I thought of Googling it myself, so I
Congratulations.
Thank you, and cut and paste it. So with that, So with that, let's kind of jump into something I kind of brought up before with you guys, is George Orwell. So Orwell talked about how politicians use language and words in a way to kind of deceive the public or not uncover the whole truth. Now, before we dive into what Orwell said, I kind of wanted to talk about Orwell.
Sure.
Does anyone want to kick things off with him? Because I have some exciting things to say. John, why don't you say a few things about why you like Orwell, and then I'll jump into my political perspective on it.
Well, I mean, even regardless of his politics, I just love the way he writes, the way he strings together. So he's a novelist and an essayist, or he was rather, and he kind of set the tone of like anti-tyrannical, anti-fascism, like kind of literature, and that's one of the things that made him really famous. And I think it even mentions it in the article, right? And I was always appreciative of the fact that through his literature, I was able to like learn or gain a glimpse of like the nature of a political ideology that is kind of far removed. You know, the whole debate whether or not we are in Orwell's dystopia or Aldous Huxley's dystopia,
Yes.
right? And it's interesting because certain parts of the world fit under the 1984 model of fascism, and certain parts of the world fit under the dystopia that Aldous Huxley is like too much entertainment, too much information, etc. So
Yes.
it's just I like him simply due to the fact, regardless of his politics, that he's a very competent writer. I love his writing. It's beautiful.
Yeah, he's an excellent writer, and not a lot of people know this, but he participated in the Spanish Civil War during World War, or before and during World War II. So Spanish Civil War, for those of you who don't know, was basically while the world was kind of experimenting with fascism, like with Germany and you know all that stuff happening before World War II. Spain had a civil war, and it was essentially. It kind of came down to fascist right-wing forces, and then more liberal, and then some socialist forces. And he actually fought on the side of the socialists to free Spain of the fascist dictator. So I think that's also important to realize when he's writing these things about tyranny, about government oppression, about politicians saying and doing things to kind of circumvent us. He's seen, like, you know, he's been in there in the worst of it. He fought against fascists and then came out and said, this is how fascists behave. So
He has a personal stake.
exactly. I mean, we all have a personal stake against fascism, but
That's fair.
all right. So let's start talking about these points that Orwell brought up. So the first thing is he talks about cliches and dying metaphors. He says how politicians, whenever they use these kinds of cliches or metaphors, they're kind of they're just trying to use it as like filler. You know, we've had like an example. I think in the article he mentioned was saying how Obama was you know, just one expert from it. They would say that, oh, America is standing shoulder to shoulder with France after like this terrorist attack.
Time and again,
yeah, things like that. So they tend to use like a lot of these cliches. So like, why? What do you guys think is the reason for kind of using these? Like, what's the purpose of it?
I've seen it sort of help people connect two different thoughts. A lot of times I feel like it's what they're using to bridge the two concepts, whether or not they are actually connected to each other is something different. But I don't know. That's what I've noticed personally, where you're like, okay, those two things had nothing to do with each other, but great segue.
Yeah, that was actually one of two things that I was thinking, is that it kind of gives the listener a connection and you feel at home. That might be a bit too sentimental to say, but you feel at home with what the speaker is saying and you feel like you can trust them. And the second thing I was going to say, and this is obviously coming from my background as a lawyer and more importantly last year when I was acting as a neutral, is these cliches, when you know the true substance of what's being written, whether you're the writer or not, you look past it. So when I see parties presenting pleadings to us and they're using these cliches, it's very much like a really eye roll, because you know that it's just being used as fluff. But you know, you find yourself being convinced by the cliches whether or not you, like Elena said, whether or not you understand the true connection.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times, you know, they're trying to put across a point, but also use it as like filler. So it's just, I think, even though it might be, you can argue that it's like deceptive for someone to use like these cliches and stuff, but I think honestly it's just like more like lazy writing, right? I mean, that's what cliches kind of are. To everyone knows what it means, so you just kind of like throw it in there, so it's like easy for people to connect to.
And it's interesting because the question you're asking too is like, what role do these cliches play, especially like, let's say in a speech or in some kind of plea deal or something like that. But in my mind, I'm thinking, what about when it becomes the dominant force of the platform? Right. So Trump's message being "Make America Great Again." I didn't know that was not originally his. That was Reagan's. I didn't know that until recently.
Right.
And so this is something that you were saying, Elena, that it kind of bridges two concepts. But I would also say it bridges like this metaphysical thing, because "Make America Great Again" taps into this invisible force of nostalgia people have for something that maybe didn't really exist in the first place. And so it's become a dominant thing in his platform. And now it's going to be "Keep America Great." Right. So I'm just so interested in not only like how that works in his speeches, let's say, or just in the political discourse, but it's become his main platform. That's how he got elected, was this phrase, right? It's on his hats, it's on like his shirts, it's on his memorabilia. I mean, he trademarks it. It's really intense. Yeah. So it's a metaphor and a cliche that has a staying power with a lot of people because it taps like right there.
Yeah, it evokes that emotional response.
The pathos, right? If we're talking about rhetoric.
Right.
Exactly.
But I think where the issue is, and I'm saying this from recent personal experience, and a lot of my friends hear me say this all the time, is, when you don't know the cliche and you don't know the metaphor, you're kind of giving them a blank stare. So being raised by, immigrant parents, like I don't know a lot of sayings, like a lot of American sayings. My parents are educated, but, for example, we were talking about this last night, close but no cigar, or certain metaphors and sayings that are used very frequently in political speeches. I'm kind of left wondering, what do you mean?
What does that even mean?
Yeah, what does that even mean? So I think that just depends on the cliches that are being used. And I think, maybe I'm at the bottom of the population in terms of my understanding of these cliches and metaphors, but I'm assuming most of the population understands it when it's said.
Or makes up an understanding.
Or makes up an understanding, but that's risky.
But I think that's like why they use these cliches, because they can be broad enough where, you can perceive it from, whatever perspective at times, and it's just like an easy way kind of out without actually having to explain anything. So,
Yeah.
And then I guess this is kind of moving on to the next point, which is wordiness, which all of these kind of like, bleed into each other, but wordiness. So it's the concept that politicians just kind of use extra words as like filler when they're talking to you. So why do you guys think politicians use like all of these extra words to describe something that they can say with, one or two words?
To string the audience along?
Yeah, well, I think, they need time to make their points, because if you make 5 important points in 5 sentences, one after each other, it's a bit much. So you need to give the audience time to kind of digest things, because there's time for you to zone out. Mm-hmm. And there's time once you start using your tone and intonation to say, oh, by the way, this is my main point. 10 sentences of, bullshit, and then another tone and intonation differentiation to say that this is my next big point. And I also noticed that writing as a lawyer is, when your writing is not concise, it's because you don't know the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
And you find yourself doing that because you're beating around the bush, and you're maybe a bit scared to get to the point because it's not in your favor. So that's kind of,
it's either, I definitely agree. It's either you don't know the issue or you're trying to hide the truth of it, because when you use more words, you're essentially kind of like distracting someone. In a way. You're distracting your viewer or your audience with putting in all these extra words that don't actually add any additional meaning to the point that you're trying to make.
It's like, come out with it.
Yeah.
I mean, exactly what you're, like Dina's explaining, is also it's taking the attention maybe through a story, and then changing what you want to say. Like it's a way to hide behind something else.
I mean, like on here I have like a little example. where there's like extra words used that are really not necessary. So it's like if someone says, taking about how our nation has learned from past history, like past is pointless to put in front of history, and how the major political breakthroughs of the 21st century, if they're political breakthroughs and they're clearly major, you don't have to put that in, will help. Breakthroughs of the 21st century will help us, the people, unite together and reconsider again just how lucky we are to be alive. Like us, the people, like you don't have to say both. You don't have to say unite together. If you're doing one, you're doing the other. Reconsider again. Like, these are extra words that they put in. And honestly, I think a lot of times it's, if they're on the spot responding to someone, they're just trying to think of what to say next.
Yeah,
so
of
these
course.
words are like a natural filler. So it's not, I don't think it's always nefarious necessarily.
Yeah, it's not malicious every time.
Yeah.
When I learned not to use the words, like so many words, it was honestly in like college applications where you had a word count.
Yeah.
And I was like,
exactly.
I'm going to stop using redundant words.
Yeah.
You have to take the time to edit your work, and because when you're writing it, it's natural as humans, unless you're one of those scholars that is used to writing these papers and that's how you think is concisely, but we don't think concisely, and that's okay because we're thinking as we're writing. So when you go through the editing process and you really look at what words you're using, you notice how many red marks you get. Like, for example, another big one I have recently been super conscious about is saying whether or not. Whether in itself encompasses the not.
Right.
So instead of saying whether or not you like that, whether you like that, because if you don't like it, if it encompasses
It already
throw the
works.
or not after, whether you like it or not. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that, like, when you reread something that you wrote, you can just go through and just kind of like, just cut it down,
Naturally, yeah.
And I think that's that speaks to just in general, like how to do good writing in itself. Is that maybe if you're on the spot, it's not that big of a deal if you use a lot of words because you're trying to think, you're in that moment, you're trying to process it. But when it becomes like kind of like a regular thing, if it's like a certain politician is coming out and just always filling what they're saying with just words that don't actually add context or content, then that's the stuff to watch out for.
Yeah, and you have to ask yourself why. Like, one of the things I tell my students repeatedly is that, one of the things I liked in what we were discussing is with rhetoric, it's a balance of different compositional factors and rhetorical techniques. So the three major things are logos, pathos, and ethos, right? And so in the example you brought up just like a minute ago, where it's saying we the people, et cetera, in any way, shape, or form, that's a method of bridging ethos, saying, hey, I am making this speech that you're listening to, but I am no different than you. So that's an ethos kind of example, right? But there can be other examples where we're saying past histories, let's say, and again, trying to evoke that sense of maybe nostalgia or what history means to somebody. That's that emotional appeal. So that's pathos, right? You can be wordy in facts as well. You could be wordy in statistics and facts and really beat someone over the head, and that's being wordy in logos. So it's about the balance of these things, and a good politician is going to be able to navigate those waters well, and a bad politician will try to hide it. And maybe that's what makes them good, perhaps, is that they'll try to hide the fact that they're not really using too many facts, and they're using way more emotion or trying to bridge. Like, why do you think what's his name, Mitt Romney, when he was running for president back in the day against Barack Obama, he'd oftentimes take off his coat when he was talking. He'd take off his jacket so that he would just be in a button down to make himself seem like more of a working class man, but he's loaded.
Oh,
the guy's
yeah.
loaded, right? But he would make himself seem like a working class man, and that's part of his ethos, right? That's him without writing or without verbal speech. That's in his body language and in the way he's dressed. So it's actually everywhere. The wordiness can be part of how you're dressed as well. You could be too dressed, right, for certain things. So
yeah, definitely the visual aspect comes big into play there. But let's kind of move on to the next points, because I think that might actually come up a bit later, but here, we'll see. So the next one is speaking in a passive voice. Okay, so this is one that politicians do a lot, and this is actually, I really think this is an interesting one, and I think it really says something about, not just the politicians, but how we as like a society, how we accept responsibility, how we move forward, how we talk about issues and problems. Because what a passive voice is, if you don't know, like an active voice would be, I made a mistake. A passive voice is, mistakes were made. So
Who
it's
made
like,
them?
Exactly. The subject is not being clear. It's the subject is not, you're not taking full responsibility of it. So I always, it's a lot of politicians use that kind of terms whenever they're speaking. They say, oh, this happened, and then the responsibility is not on anyone specific, but they're still getting away with admitting that, oh, there was a mistake made.
Sounds like
for
typical.
interpretation.
Yeah, I was going to say it sounds like typical lawyer language.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, some of the other ones, we can go back and forth and talk about, oh, well, is it really ill-minded? Are they just trying to be politically savvy, or this or that? But I feel like this one is just pure political, and it only serves to benefit whomever is making the statement. Because when you hear that, you're just hearing that, you're just hearing the subject of it, but it's not connected to anyone. So
Something needs to be done.
Yeah.
But not outlining exactly what, and
And who.
And who.
Exactly. And it gives them room to be shifty and flip-floppy, and it's definitely not done on accident.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. It's not an accidental thing, especially for like a presidential speechwriter who's hired on like some basis of integrity and experience in their field. They're not going to be writing some accidental passive voice. They know what passive voice is and how it can benefit or hurt, I guess, in some cases. But yeah.
I think it also, like your mistake example, sometimes if you're trying to be concise, instead of saying, I made this mistake on October 2nd, you made this mistake on November 10th, these people who are not connected to this issue made this mistake in December, you just say mistakes were made.
that's true. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it can be also a way of just being more concise.
Summarizing it and kind of like getting it out
Less
there.
words.
Less
Less
words.
Yeah.
I wish that would work with my parents. Like, hey, mistakes were made. We can't think about them too much.
Which mistakes and who made them? See, we need the politicians' parents up to like question them,
Yeah,
right?
That'd be pretty
Put them
funny.
back, put them on the spot.
Yeah, they're getting away
Who made the
scot-free.
mistakes, young one? Who made them?
All right. So moving on from this one, there are sentences saved from anticlimax.
This one I didn't understand too much. It was a bit difficult to wrap my mind around.
I think it's it kind of plays into the other one. It's trying to reassure the audience that they know what they're talking about without actually explaining it.
like repetition.
It's trying to say like, I guess like, okay, like an example might be like the Iraq War, when they put up like mission accomplished, mission wasn't accomplished, but it's trying to show that there is
Spoiler alert! It wasn't accomplished.
no, but it's trying to instill like a what's the word when you trust someone in like power. Confidence, trying to instill confidence in the leaders, like, okay, like, stuff might not be as good, it might be troubling, but this guy knows what he's talking about, he has it under their belt.
Goes back to the cliche too, right? In a way.
It does, but I think the cliches are more direct terms, whereas this is someone won't come out and say, I'm sorry, I'm unsure. Politicians will never come out and say that, I'm sorry, I don't know what the solution is, because a politician needs to be someone who is, I have the solutions, these are the solutions, and the other guys aren't doing them. So that's where I think this more comes from, that it's trying to stray away from showing uncertainty and instability, and instead exercising stability and strength, and basically that like they have their shit together, right? And that you shouldn't doubt them because they're smart and they know what they're talking about.
That's interesting. Like you said something interesting where you said politicians should be like confident and display, strength. And so in that statement, I think maybe soon that perception may be changing as we have more women in office, more women like actively running for, you know, different different positions. And inherently, like the way we study political communication has always been extremely masculine, because that's the only images we have ever seen. So they defined it, they've lived it for so long, and it's habitually like, it's a bias like that we have, that our politicians need to be this way. So I feel like it's a little bit of changing.
So then should we, there's an interesting thing is that, especially right now, like this freshman class of Congress people, there's a lot more women, right? And at least with, like, let's say Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or that Muslim woman Tlaib. I forget her first name. But regardless,
Ilham,
like
Ilham
Tlaib, where she made like this kind of like perceived anti-Semitic remark or whatever.
Right.
It feels like there's a lot of scrutiny paid to the way that they speak because they're women.
Yeah.
But my question is, are they forced to like play a masculine game with their rhetoric, or are we now, as consumers of the body politic, are we supposed to gear our expectations and maybe not be as confident anymore in our politicians? Or like, what's the relationship between a woman and confidence in politics?
That was my question as well.
So I think like that's an interesting question, and I think it's going to be really interesting how people generally now are going to respond, and how now that they're actually elected, because they were elected under very like different times where everybody was like, we want something different. We want someone who's going to tell the truth. We want someone who we can rely on and is not necessarily going to say everything we want to hear, but will actually do things. So they were elected without those standards in a bit. And so it's going to be interesting if we're going to change our spectrum of what it means to be a politician, or if now that they got elected, if they're going to, you know, like assimilate to that.
Yeah.
thing.
Is it going to eat them, or are they going to are they going to add some seasoning? You know,
I mean, I hope it's the latter, and that we are going to change what it means for us to have politicians. Even so, I saw this like interesting piece about just visually the design that the women who have been running with different visual campaigns. They're using colors other than red, blue, and white.
That's interesting.
So like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, like she was the first one to do that. Like she had a really, really bold font, italicized, and it was just, we have never seen any type of campaign with that kind of font, with those colors. So it's interesting. They're taking ownership over it. And then there's, you know, like Elizabeth Warren's campaign is also a little bit like, it's got some of that color, but it's different. It's not as masculine. The colors are changing. I don't know. It's kind of exciting to see actually visually the difference between that. So I hope the seasoning is going to stay.
Yeah, sure.
And we're going to get some more things in the mix. So.
Yeah, and I think from what you guys were saying, I do think that we are redefining, you know, what it means or what we expect from our politicians. And I think it's going more towards the point from what you were saying that, you know, we're electing these people so that they do speak their minds, that they do hold people accountable, that they do represent their communities and can actually sympathize with issues on them. I think we're redefining politicians in a way where we're getting them back to being public servants, and I think that's like the biggest thing from all of this. Because
it's a reaction, though.
Yeah,
it is a reaction to this crazy kind of turbulent world right now.
It's been for so long that we've done politics in a certain way. Where every so often, I think a nation kind of goes through these little surges where they kind of rehash things up, and we haven't had that for a very long time. So I think that's why everything is kind of coming from both left and right all at once.
You know, there's like one of the reasons too that at the end of the day, like when I see somebody like, you know, toxic or vitriolic online, like particularly like Trump supporters, when I like, you know, and again, like I don't care what your politics are at all, as long as you can argue it well, right? But I kind of sympathize with them because at the end of the day, they bought a message about draining the swamp, and they bought a message about like returning honesty to politics. And whether or not they saw this coming makes no difference. The fact is, I think everybody wants a similar thing, but we're just articulating that thing differently depending on which leader is the one being the mouthpiece towards that thing. right?
Yeah.
And so when we're going back to this issue of like the climax or the anticlimax, it's whoever can deliver the climax of truth to power, I think is what we're looking for. Is like, that's why Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is like such fire right now, is because she says, hey, did you guys know whenever they do the orientation for the Congress people, there's literally like corporate lobbyists like all day, just like like schmoozing. No one's ever said, I mean, no one's ever like just said that like normally, like as part of like a tweet, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like we all want a similar thing, I think, but the messages just get diluted and crossed, and it comes back to language.
Yeah, and another thing, I just want to, AOC is my hero. I love that woman. Yeah. But
I'm mixed.
Another you mentioned the lobbyists, like how they basically come in and they're doing like orientation for Congress. Another point, I think more recently she was on TV talking about where she took a picture and put it on Twitter or Instagram. It was within the Capitol building, and it was a line of homeless people inside the Capitol building.
I saw that.
And what this was these homeless people were in line to meet with either for committee meetings or congresspersons. I think it was for committee meetings or committee hearings. They were standing in line because lobbyists paid them to stand in line so that they can get the best front seats and all that. So like lobbyists are literally at the Capitol building bribing homeless people so that they can have a seat in a public hearing. And you know, it's ridiculous. And she points these things out, and she shows
that there is an app for that, by the way.
There's an
what?
app for what?
For standing in line, TaskRabbit. So,
yeah.
Not
I thought for
not
like
for
lobbyists.
I thought to hire homeless people to stand in line.
What?
Damn, I mean, that's an interesting idea though, an app to like put homeless people like to some kind of economic use, I guess.
But it's
that's
like,
kind of
that's
interesting
a human being. Yeah.
No, I
like,
know. When it comes out of my mouth, it sounds like it's like kind of a factory kind of thing. But in general, I think that's actually an interesting kind of angle to pursue.
It would be, but it's like, I feel like that's exploitation of like a human being. Whereas instead of putting in the resources to create this app to make life easier for middle and upper class people, they can put that energy towards helping the homeless get back on. I mean,
I also don't know that homeless all have cell phones with reception.
Yeah.
To like be on these things.
No, truly.
They would have to be. Someone would have to send like a signal through like the alley or something. Like.
Oh geez.
Anyway,
well, one thing I wanted to say. This is from a few minutes ago, but it's in my head. Where John, you were saying that it's either going to be hopefully the new freshman class, or any other new politician is going to hopefully either change the rhetoric and the style, or are they going to get eaten up by the system? But I would add a third perspective, and it's, or are they just going to drink the Kool-Aid? I don't want to. Well, I do want to be the negative Nancy in this situation. So some of them might cave in. And it's not because they're being eaten up. It's because maybe they just start to believe that the rhetoric of the past, 200 years is how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, some people get into the office, they see the realities of things, they see that they can't please everyone, that certain decisions have to be made, and those decisions end up I don't say robbing, but it kind of like you have to put in resources to like, let's say schools, and then you promise your constituents that you're going to put resources towards like rebuilding roads, and then you can't rebuild the roads, and then you're caught in like a mess. Or like you say, like over time, I think that leads people to realize, okay, the game is not as simple as we thought it was. We have to concede. We have to compromise on some of these things.
Well, I think what AOC has also been doing is redefining the game. Like changing the rules, because
or letting us know the rules that even existed the way they exist.
Exactly.
Like, that's a big one.
Yeah, communicating the rules and then shedding light on why it's kind of messed up, and how we, shedding light on what we didn't know was there. But yeah, I hope that this makes way for them to sort of change everything, because that set of people have been left out of creating those rules. So it's going to be interesting.
Definitely will. Yeah.